about the sheds in Australia very briefly. It was around the early 90s, sometime between 1990 and 1995, this stuff started happening. And it started happening in different places kind of simultaneously. It wasn't that somebody got a bright idea and went out. It was a few different groups, so primarily guys who were disengaged from society a little bit, some ex-Vietnam vets and some Aboriginal men in different parts of Australia. And they just started to come together. And it was a healthy alternative to the pub, and there was no great plan. And it wasn't that in 2005, a guy called Professor Barry Golden, literally he's a researcher in adult learning, and he started taking pins and sticking them in a map, and he realised it was happening an awful lot more than previously expected. And so in 2005 they had their first gathering, and at that gathering they realised it was happening an awful lot more than previously expected. So they set up the Australian Men's Sheds Association. And that was basically David's task between 2005 and 2007. And at that time when they set up, there was 150 sheds in Australia. So since 2007, that's grown to over 1,000. And their recognition of that is quite simply because they set up what they call the peak body, an organisation to support and promote the development of men's sheds. And it started, in my opinion, that was the reason of the exponential growth about men's sheds in Australia and also in other parts of the world. So when I went to Australia first a couple of years ago, that was kind of the nugget of information that I hung on to most. When I came back to Ireland, it was like in 2009, we tried to have a conference or a get-together. It took us about a year to organise. It was October 2010. So a crowd maybe similar to this, and there were 7 sheds in Ireland, because the idea had been coming across the world kind of organically as well, and set up in 2 or 3 places around at one time. But we went about setting up the Irish Men's Sheds Association, and since then it's absolutely blossomed. Like I say, there's now 178 men's sheds in Ireland on both jurisdictions, north and south, the fact that we're very, very happy about. And we reckon that there's about 5,500 different men participating in the sheds every week. And that's actually quite conservative. That's an average of 30 guys per shed, but we know some sheds, there's a shed in Clarny, for example, it's got 150 guys on the books. But there's also small rural villages where there might be 6 guys, you know, and it's everything in between. So I suppose the key messages I have for you, I was thinking about this a lot, and there's quite a lot, like, and I obviously spend a lot of time thinking about men's sheds. But I suppose what was reconfirmed for me in this trip to Australia is that there's no one right way of doing men's sheds. That there's all different ways of doing it, and that they're tied together through kind of a similar ethos or a similar set of values that goes and underpins the whole of them. You know, and it's the diversity within the sheds that's kind of the secret to its success. So as Barry says, and Barry is also, as well as being a professor, is a patron of the Australian Men's Sheds Association, and he gets back in Edge, Ireland or the UK every couple of years. And he says, men's sheds are not McDonald's. You're not going to get the same thing in any 2 sheds, it's a different menu. And basically, the activities they take part in, whether there's some common activities, it might be woodwork or metalwork, but that's only the tip of the iceberg. Anything you can think of is acceptable. And that the guys choose to do is what they choose to do, and that's really fine. And as well as that, there'll be a different group of men. Like I find to think it's linked to the area. And it's part of the reason why the sheds work as well. It's like, it's a simple name. Like, say if you've got the Camden Men's Shed, or the Waterford Men's Shed, where I used to live until recently. Every place has got its own kind of unique background and its own unique potential. For example, where I lived in Waterford, 14 guys used to meet around the corner every Tuesday. Now, it wasn't a men's shed, it was just a group of men. But they were all ex-Waterford crystal workers. So can you imagine the skills that those guys have? That's probably nowhere else in the world. You know, and they can use that in their shed to pass on to young people, or to create bits of work to make the shed sustainable, or whatever they need to do. Similarly, I was up at the opening of a shed in Belfast not that long ago, and it was very close to the old site of Harlan and Wolf, which not that long ago was the biggest shipbuilding yard in the world. You know, so all those skills and background and the potential that lies dormant within that is available for the sheds in that area. I think also on that point you've got the idea that the Belfast men's sheds, or the Camden men's sheds, or the Watford, wherever men's shed, anyway, there's something in the name. Like you've got the place that I just mentioned. Obviously, the most important ingredient, the shed without the men, is just a building, and its uses, well, for other uses of course, but you know, for our purposes, it's pointless. You know, and then you've got the shed, and the shed is important as well. I remember when I was over in Australia first, I was really enthused by the whole philosophy of it. about guys coming together, and you know that we have the motto that men don't talk face to face, they talk shoulder to shoulder. And we were with the idea that this could work anywhere, you know, it doesn't necessarily have to be in a building, that they could share premises with other groups or whatever. But the more I get into it, the more I realise the men having like ownership over that space where you can lock the key behind you when you're going out, and you can like leave the sawdust on the ground where you don't have to wash up the cups if you don't feel like it, or you don't get in trouble for eating the wrong pack of biscuits and all that stuff. That's very important, and then you go back the next day and you pick up where you left off, you know. That's very important, but also in the name, I think it's very important, because we know that men's sheds, in Ireland I used to call it kind of an accidental version of joined up thinking, because we certainly didn't mean to do it, but in one way, it meets the objectives of so many different, say, government departments, for example. Like if it's Department of Health, you know, is it the Department of Education and Lifelong Learning, or non-formal or informal learning, Department of Community, in Ireland we call it Community, Environment and Local Government. Or is it like equality? Is it like, it's all these things, the men's sheds are meeting the objectives that different government departments have some responsibility to. So, with the sheds, it's very important that they're just called sheds. This is my opinion anyway, because if you call it like the men's adult learning group, lots of men don't go. If you call it, and I'm sure you'll agree with me, the men's health program, lots of men don't turn up. Like if you call it, for example, like, I don't know, the Wednesday night men's counteracting social isolation group. Who's going to go along to that? Like, you know, the Champions League, I'm telling you. So it's very important, because if, you know, all those things can happen. It's so easy to walk up and, you know, say, is this the place that the guys are doing up the out 150? I used to have one of them, and you just go in, and it just happens so simply and so easily. And I think it's really important that we continue that. I suppose I touched on the thing about like there's no single one way of doing it. There is a few things, however, in common. I think you know, it's grassroots. It comes from the men. I think organising, having a network, whether it's a men's sheds association in the UK, I think that's very important to support each other. And the network between the sheds will become just as important as the friendships you develop within your own sheds. I think one of the things that we find very important, and the guys in Australia will be equally strong on this, is that the sheds need to be open to all men, and quite simply, like things like racism or homophobia or discrimination on any grounds. It's not acceptable in sport, it's not acceptable in the workplace, and we can't let it be acceptable in any way in men's sheds. And I think that's very important as well. How am I going on time? So I suppose the best bit of advice, the bits of advice we give people when they're thinking about setting up sheds, is if you could get yourself or a few of your mates who are interested and get in a car or a minibus and go and visit one or two of the existing sheds, like you'll get a feel for what goes on. It's very hard to explain the buzz that happens in a shed, but like you pick up on that energy and that atmosphere, and that's kind of what will motivate you when you get home, because inevitably it's a good experience. But and just like that, everybody have their own ideas, and you're walking away from the shed that you just visited, and you'll be thinking, nah, we do it better than them lads, you know. And this is what we do differently. But I'll wrap up with a couple of stories, but I suppose just we've got the Irish Men's Sheds Association have an app about how to set up a shed, and the Australian Men's Sheds have a downloadable manual. You know, get your hands on either of them, and you know, some bits, there's stuff like health and safety legislation that mightn't be quite accurate for the UK, but it's a good pointer in the right direction. I'll just finish with a couple of stories. Like two things that I remember that like, to me, say a lot about why sheds are important. There was one shed in a place in Wicklow in County Wexford, Wicklow in County Wicklow in Ireland, obviously. And the guys were setting up a shed, and they were after having one or two meetings, and the guy who was like mainly the main organiser in this small town took a phone call, and he could tell that the guy at the other side of the other end of the phone was kind of shy and quiet and wasn't very confident on the phone. So your man was asking, what's this men's shed idea all about? And he was explaining to him, and they had a meeting coming up on the next Monday evening. And after the explanation, you know, it's a place where men gather and come together and work on stuff they're interested in, and have a cup of tea with their mates and all that. He said, will you come along? And he said, sure I will. And he said, will you bring a friend? And there was a moment silent, and the fellow said, I don't have him. But your man said, you do now, you see. And that's what sheds do for fellas in communities. And I'll just finish on this. last week, as part of the trip to Australia, we went on a shed crawl. So we went on a few of them, and that's serious consequences than the other shed crawl. But and one of the places we visited, and one of the great things about the shed crawl is that really all the sheds are unique, and you learn so much from all the different guys. But this particular shed is a place called Whitsilla, just about an hour outside Ballarat in north-east Victoria, north-west Victoria. And it's got kind of a low socio-economic group. So the previous shed we had visited were all lads. There were a bunch of 14 or 15 retired guys who were reasonably well off and then this was the complete opposite. Lads had various issues, and they were out of work for various reasons, and that's one of the things I suppose that's going on in Ireland. I know Brian gave a really good context. I'll get back to my story. Brian gave a really good picture of what's happening in Scotland, and it's very similar to Ireland. Like we've got there's 14% unemployment in Ireland, and 2/3 of them are men. So we've got 250,000 guys unemployed, and there's another, I think, 275,000 guys who are retired. So that's like over 500,000 guys who potentially don't have the opportunity to fulfill their potential at whatever stage of life they're at. Go back to the shed in Whitsilla anyway. So all these guys were here, and they were telling quite a sad story actually about one of their members who had been really isolated, and he came and they encouraged him to join the shed, and he did eventually, and he became part of the group. But he got sick, and he had to go to a hospital down in Melbourne. And when he was dying in the hospital in Melbourne, they realised that he had no family. So he passed away, unfortunately. And a bit similar, I don't know how it is here, but this guy had no family or nobody will later on. So the hospital were going to bury him in a small graveyard beside the hospital. So the men shed said they weren't having that, and they took him back and they buried him beside their shed under a little tree up in this place in Whitsilla. And it's just like one of those things that stayed with me anyway after my trip. So I just also want to say before I finish up that over in Ireland that we're really happy to have whatever connections or support that we have to offer you that, and that we're having a conference on the 16th of November in Castlebar. It'll be great to see somebody there. It's all about the shed. So thanks very much.